Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Chris, and welcome back to the Bible study series. I know that it has been a little bit of a gap between the last video and this video here, and it's for good reason, though. I have been, part one is that I've been working on music. That's the other part of this Moses Wolf ministry, which is really awesome. So I've been working on music. I got a brand new song called Victorious finished. Can't wait to share that with you guys. I really pray that that's going to be something that it just gets into people's hearts and spirits, and is very uplifting and points out something very important about the victory of Christ. And then the other part of kind of the gap in the timeline here is that we are getting into chapter 25 in this next part, and the really I think cool thing that hit me and caused me to kind of slow down with this and become patient and make sure that I soak all this in is the fact that in chapter 25 we find out that Abraham dies, that he passes away. And with this video, normally what we do in these videos is, we read through the chapter, we'll touch on some things and recap. But kind of like the last one in chapter 24, we kind of did a recap on Sarah's life, Abraham's wife, and just how important and integral she was in God's plan and everything, and how much faith was needed for all of this to happen. And so then, the example of faith that we should all follow through this man right here, Abraham. This guy's life is coming to an end, and it's like, how do you sum up a man's life like this? How do we say, wow, this was the whole picture? And it is tough. I was thinking about that, and I'm like, wow, I really want to pay honor and tribute and just give thanks to this man, and really truly understanding the depth of the importance of his life and everything that he meant. Just like God said, through you and through your descendants, all of the families, including mine, including yours, of the earth will be blessed. Okay? Through this man right here. This is no small thing, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows the importance of this man's life. And so I think tonight what we're going to do is we will read through just a little bit of chapter 25, but I want to break this up into two parts. I want this part to give kind of just to be dedicated to Abraham, and we're going to talk about some of his life and some other things from the New Testament pointing back to Abraham's life, and just really making that picture grow a little bit more. And we are going to find out just something so key, so amazing, that I honestly, if we've been reading through this, we know that, oh man, this man has done so much. Oh, but goodness, there's so much more of what he understood, and with his relationship with the Lord and with the covenant promises and everything. There was something much deeper that Abraham understood, and we're going to cover that right now. And I think when we do, it just brings his whole life into clear focus, the whole picture of it. And we just say, thank you. It is incredible. So this will be part one, and then we'll go into part two, where we'll pick up and go through the rest of chapter 25, where we're going to get introduced to Isaac's sons. Very, very awesome thing that we're going to see there. But let's get into Abraham here, and as always, please pray before diving into the Lord's word. And oh man, let's watch what's about to happen here. So a few quick things in chapter 25 that it says is that Abraham did, in fact, he married another wife whose name was Keturah, and she gave birth to other sons. I want you to highlight one of those in particular. Midian. We're going to see Midian, the Midianites, much more, in the Old Testament, in the Bible. So that's something that, we kind of want to point out, and we want to remember that. We can come back to this, that this woman here, Keturah, she gave birth to Midian, along with several other sons to them. And it goes through kind of a list of descendants and everything Abraham had through Keturah. But there in verse 5 it says, Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac. Okay, but before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to a land in the east, away from Isaac. So I want to point out two very important things here. Having multiple wives, or having a concubine of women, was completely normal. It was an approved thing. This was nothing out of the ordinary. This was something of the time. So it's not like Abraham had another, and he was married to this woman actually while he was married to Sarah as well. He had a concubine as well. These were all, part of, the whole family of his household and everything. And this was a completely acceptable, approved thing of the time. It was, and you think about it, be fruitful and multiply, one of the very first command. And this was an absolute way to do that. Okay, and we know how Abraham, how he carries himself and how things were done. Well, for the most part, it was tried to do with, in the right respect and everything like that. So this was completely normal. So wanted to get that out of the way first. Then the second thing is, notice how he says, but before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to a land in the east, away from Isaac. Now, this is very important because, again, when I just said about Abraham doing things in the right way in terms of his whole household and everything, he knew, he knew and was completely focused on the promise of God and how this was all going to be flowing through his son Isaac that God had promised through Sarah. So all of these other sons that he had through his concubine or through this other woman that he married named Keturah and all of that, that's all good and dandy, but he sent them away, to make sure that Isaac was just in the right place and that he had the complete focus. And so that is the, precaution, or however you want to call it, that was taken, a very important thing, that Abraham was focusing on here for his son Isaac and for the promises of God that he knew were going to go through him as well. All right, so getting into verse 7, it says that Abraham lived for 175 years, and he died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. And I love this. He breathed his last breath, or some other translations say he gave up the ghost and joined his ancestors, or were gathered to his people in death. All right, I actually want you to highlight that. I think that's a very interesting thing. It's part of this whole big story, this whole big picture of understanding what's going on and everything. A little small piece of it right there, but love the fact that he says he gave up the ghost. Remember, in the very, very beginning of Genesis, this whole story, how God breathed the breath of life into the nostrils of the man. And it's like, this is what he was saying. He gave up the ghost. He gave up the spirit. The breath of life was given back to God, and it is only by his breath that we are speaking and living and breathing right now. And here he breathed his last breath. Abraham gave up the ghost. He gave up the spirit of life. God's breath. That is an amazing thing. And joined his ancestors in death. All right. something to hang on to. We're going to get back into that a lot deeper as we continue to go on. But I want to, it goes on to talk about that his sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Remember, Ishmael was Hagar's son, who was the servant of Sarah, the Egyptian servant and everything. We know all the story that happened with that. They went and buried him alongside of Sarah in that cave, in that field that he bought. Remember, had you guys read that. So we're going to stop right there, and I want to start going into this discussion on Abraham, our guy here. And I want to start, I think, by just reading a little bit from the study Bible here. It kind of gives a little glimpse, and I like what it says here. Okay, it says, first, Abraham had a choice to make. His decision was between setting out with his family and belongings for parts unknown or staying right where he was. He had to decide between the security of what he already had and the uncertainty of traveling under God's direction. All he had to go on was God's promise to guide and bless him. So if you remember that, all right, right when we met, Abraham here, and God said, remember what he said? He said, leave your family and you're going to go to a place that I will show you. He just said go. He didn't even tell him this is where you're going. He said just go, and then I'm going to show you a place. Right? And then here comes all the promises, and wow, it's like, I know, I know all the my family and the belongings and everything, all this comfort that I have here, but God is just saying go and out into the unknown. And it's like, okay. And it says all he had to go on was God's promise to guide and bless him. This is the first piece of the faith pie, puzzle, whatever you want to call it, that gives us an indication of just the amount of faith that Abraham had. Such an incredible thing, the amount of trust and obedience that Abraham had in the Lord. It says Abraham could hardly have been expected to visualize how much of the future was resting on his decision of whether to go or stay. Right? But his obedience affected the history of the whole world. And I think that is so key, because remember, as we kept reading through these different stories and whatnot, and as God would bring up the promises again, remember how every time that God would bring up the promises that he was going to fulfill through Abraham and his descendants, that we kept getting more and more information about it. You remember that? It started off as just go and I'm going to bless you and watch what happens type of thing, to where then he gets the full complete picture that all of the families of the earth are going to be blessed through your descendants. And this is going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when it's talking about that promised seed. Very, very important, right? But in the beginning here, when we first met Abraham, he could hardly have been expected to visualize how much of the future was resting on his decision of whether to go or stay. And that's the thing, folks. A lot of times when God is going to call us, he might just call us to the first step. And we have no idea what the next remaining steps of our calling are going to be, and what that means for the future, for ourselves or for our family or for many, many other people. But we have to be faithful enough to take that first step, just as Abraham did. Okay? Because we saw how God continued to reveal the picture more and more of what was exactly going to happen through his promises. And it says his decision to follow God set into motion the development of the nation that God would eventually use as his own when he visited earth himself. All right, read this again. His decision, his obedience, I'll interject that in there, to follow God, set into motion the development of the nation. We're talking about that covenant family, a nation which was eventually going to become Israel. Okay? That God would eventually use as his own when he visited earth himself. When Jesus Christ came to earth, God's promise was fulfilled. And so through Abraham, the entire world was blessed. Now, we just did a whole lot of foreshadowing there. We have already known. We've been doing that this whole time. I'm telling you, every single thing that is happening, that is being read here, every single person, it is pointing to Jesus Christ. I am telling you guys, from the very beginning through the rest of this, it is going to point to the one and only. It's just him. All right? And it's amazing. So let's do this. I want to jump. So there we go. I want to jump into some other text of the Bible to kind of start bringing all of this into, I think, into a better focus as well. God's promise was fulfilled, and through Abraham, the entire world was blessed. And this was through Jesus Christ. And if you remember back a few chapters ago when we talked about when God said, hey, when the promise was fulfilled and Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and then just a short while later God said, that very promise that has now been fulfilled, I want you to take him and you're going to sacrifice him. You're going to kill him. And that way, here we go. You're going to be obedient. It's like, what in the world was going on there? And we discovered so much about how that event right there was a type of Christ. It was something that was pointing to Christ, a copy of what was to come. Such an amazing thing. And in that part of the Bible study, in that chapter, remember we talked about, like, what was it that Abraham knew? There was something that he knew, and we talked about that as well. We went into the New Testament, and we saw how, Abraham had faith that God would even bring Isaac back to life. His faith was so great that he said, even if I kill my son, I trust in the Lord enough that he has the power to bring him back to life, because the Lord is true to his word, right? And he knows that his promises will be fulfilled through his son Isaac, somehow, some way. So he knew something deeper was going on there. And then, oh man, there's another side to this that we're also going to get into, as far as what Abraham knew in terms of this whole calling and these promises of God on his life. So check this out. Here we go. First place I think I want to visit is in Galatians in the New Testament. Okay, and this is going to be after Corinthians. It's kind of a hard one to find because it's short, but it's right after Corinthians, and we are going into chapter 3, and we are going to be picking up this just to set the stage, saying the kind of title of this chapter is By Faith or By Works of the Law. All right, so this is Paul's letter to the Galatians, and he's kind of, pointing out some very important and critical things that they are doing within the church and everything there. And he's telling them something about faith right here. And look what he says in terms of Abraham that gives us, mind-blowing stuff here. We're going to verse 7. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. I want to read that again, and I want you to read this again, especially this part right here. Verse 8. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. And trust me, folks, some of you, if you're new to the Bible, we are going to get to this part in the New Testament. The Gentiles are going to be folks like you and I outside of the physical covenant family of Israel, so we can kind of put ourselves in this category of the Gentiles, so to speak. We'll get to that later, trust me. But he says, foreseeing the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached. God preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. Now, again, I had to read this a few times, and along with what we're about to read next in Hebrews, for it to really start sinking in. But I want it to start sinking in for you right here, is that when you talk about, you know, the gospel of Christ being preached, the gospel of salvation, the gospel of being able to enter into heaven, okay, into our heaven here on earth in the presence of our Savior Christ, right, who is going to sit on the judgment seat, okay, and it's either you are a part of this, you know, or you are not. This whole gospel, from Jesus coming down onto this earth, and this gospel that we talk about, so much is preached about this. It says, was foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, was preached beforehand to Abraham. Now, man, and that hit me for some reason right there, because you always think of just the gospel just showing up in the New Testament, and those people being the first to hear the gospel, the first people that the gospel was preached to, with Jesus and his disciples. And man, this is saying right here, no. And this, I think, hopefully for you, this is giving you a fuller, that this picture of this man's life is growing even more, that the gospel itself, when it is talking about, when the Lord was talking that in you all of the nations shall be blessed, that Abraham completely knew the full and complete importance of this whole thing, the power of it, the magnitude of it. Remember in chapter 3, that seed, right when man had fallen, okay, and in the same breath that the sentence and the consequence was given out, God also said, here is the redeeming salvation that will come out of it all through this promised seed, which we are seeing that is being developed right here, which started all with this man Abraham. And knowing that this all is getting passed down from generation to generations, from the sons of Seth to Noah to everyone in between, and that this man so firmly believed in that promised seed that when the Lord himself, when he approached and said, this is what I'm going to do, follow me and go to where I tell you, he said absolutely. And he wanted to be a part of this whole thing, building a covenant family, a nation that would clearly represent the Lord and be a shining light, you know, in this land of just evil and chaos and everything, to be such an example. And eventually, you know, through your descendants is going to come that seed that was talked about in chapter 3 in the very beginning of this whole story of mankind. And here's what's going to happen. He's going to be a blessing to the entire world. That's the gospel right there. That is the entire gospel. And Abraham was the first to completely experience it and be a complete part of it. Being used through him. All right. Whew. So, man, let that sink in for a second. And I think it starts to, here we go. It starts to get even more so. We go to Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith. We've been here before. All right. We didn't read this part, and I saved it for this. I think this is awesome. So check this out. We're going to go to verse 8. And here's where, man, this is crazy. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called. We've talked about this, to take that first step to go to a place that the Lord would show him that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. But by faith, he went to live in the land of promise as a foreigner, right, in this land. All right, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob. All right, we haven't met Jacob yet. We will in part 2 of this whole chapter 25 thing. Okay, so by faith he went to live in the land of promise. Remember this land of Canaan. He went, and the Lord said, this is it. This is the land that you will inherit. He went to this land of promise, and he lived there as a foreigner. He wasn't a part of this yet. He was a foreigner in this land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Verse 10, underline, highlight, wow. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. All right. I'm just giving you time to highlight that. So hang on. We're going to skip down, not to skip Sarah. We talked about that in the last video. We're skipping through to where this kind of picks up in verse 13. It said, these all died, is kind of saying everyone that's been mentioned so far, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. This is very, very important. We just read Abraham passes away, and the story's still going on. He passed away as a foreigner, as an exile, kind of in this land here on this earth. It says it right here. Not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. What is this talking about? What on earth is this talking about? Maybe it starts to clear it up here. We're going to talk about this. This is amazing. In 14 it says, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, from their comfort, that land where they were, that was theirs, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But this is key, folks. As it is, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Man, this is getting deep. All right, first things first is we go back up to verse 10 of that. He was living as a foreigner in the land of promise, in the promised land that God has been setting up through this whole thing. He was a foreigner there, living in tents with Isaac his son and Jacob his grandson, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Understand this, everyone. All right, we talk about what did Abraham know? Okay, the first thing that he knew is actually that he was not going to witness or receive these promises, this inheritance, and everything that the Lord was doing through him and through his descendants. He knew that he was not going to receive that here on earth. Okay, but listen to this. But having seen them and greeted them from afar. What is that talking about? And having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles here on earth. Man. All right, here we go. Abraham saw from afar and greeted from afar his eternity. Abraham looked forward to his eternity. He had hope for this life. He had hope for this life, but much more so for a life that was to come. All right. Now, here we go. Let's add one more layer to it. When we got down to verse 16 there, when it says, "But as it is, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one." This is very important because we talk about the rest of this story, this covenant family, these people, this nation of people that is going to represent God and be his people, right? His own people. We're going to come to find out that yes, they do take this land and take possession of this land, but then we also find out that they lose it. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. So is God's promise not happening? What is going on? Is it still yet to come? And a lot of people ask that question as, is it still yet to come while we're here on this earth? All right, there's a hint there. And and what is it still yet to come? Is God's promise for his covenant family, for his covenant people, and this inheritance still yet to come? And the answer is absolutely yes. And this gives us a hint into the mindset, into that right here with the original, I guess, vessel or instrument of this whole thing. God pouring this all out through Abraham, starting this whole thing, because they knew they desired a better country that is a heavenly one. All right, seeing it from afar, right? Acknowledge that they were strangers and exiles here on earth. They were doing all of this. They were in such faith and complete trust and obedience for something that was not even going to take place here on this earth, but something that would take place in heaven. What it says here, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. That is very important. So folks, all of this was not for a temporary earthly possession, because we're going to find, as we read through the rest of the Bible, this earth will end. Okay, I'm not trying to scare you there. I'm trying to reveal a greater hope than what this temporary earth, okay, that from the beginning, when we disobeyed, we began to stain with the sin of our hearts, okay, and take us out of what was initially intended by God. Okay, this was not all for this earthly temporary possession, but for a heavenly eternal possession. All right, folks, this is absolutely huge, and this is what Abraham knew, because we sit here and we can say, how could Abraham, and why would Abraham go through with all this, believing, all of this, taking such drastic steps and leaving everything behind, all the comforts and whatnot? That's because the gospel was first preached to him, and then through him, how all of that was going to come. And he saw things and felt the presence and had such communication and a relationship with God that showed him an eternal possession that he was going to receive. Not one here, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, acknowledging that here on this earth they were strangers. And so, folks, I absolutely just want you to hang on to this. This is such a key thing as we are going to read throughout the entire Bible. And again, I think it just brings this full picture just just into focus here, and a lot of different things that we're going to get into when we talk about heaven and earth, and that there's going to be this new creation, that is going to take place, and a city that is built and prepared for us, and what that all means, and this inheritance that we are going to get to take part of, okay, and be able to walk into and take as our own, because of this man right here and his faith. All right, man, so I hope some of that sticking, hope that and praise that it makes sense. It's incredible, and the story continues on, but we needed to know the magnitude and to get a sense of what Abraham knew, for all of this to really just start to click and make sense, not just in the story here, printed on these pages, but the story for us right now and what we have to hope for. It is so amazing, guys, and so just hang on to that, and man, I love you, and we'll catch up in the rest of chapter 25 in the next part.